The dawn came veiled in sulfur and silence. Steam lifted in lazy spirals from the hot springs of Thermopylae, as if the earth itself exhaled beneath the weight of what was to come. A milky haze drifted low across the narrow pass, curling like ghost fingers around the ankles of men who stood waiting. Their breath rose white in the still air, mingling with the sulfur mist, as though the land and the living shared the same breath, the same dread. Bronze plates clinked in ritual rhythm. A shield was tightened. A spear shaft tapped against another. The men were awake, yet said little. Spartans, Thespians, Helots, each had risen not from sleep, but from vigil, for the third night had brought the whisper of betrayal. And the fourth dawn now rose, golden and terrible, behind the distant Persian host. Leonidas stood among them, his hair braided as for burial, the scar over his cheek catching the first rays of light. He was silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because the words had already passed between them. They had passed in looks, in shared bread, in the binding of belts and the tying of sandals. They had spoken through the act of staying. 700 Thespians had remained, though offered retreat. They stayed not out of obligation, but choice, and in that choice lay the echo of something sacred. They were not warriors famed in song. Their names were not etched in the stelae at Sparta. But they stood here now, shoulder to shoulder with Spartans, beneath a sky that would soon turn black with arrows. The pass narrowed like a throat. On either side, cliffs climbed like jagged teeth, their shadows long and enclosing. The sea beyond murmured its ancient hymn, salt-laden and patient. And from the east came the sound of drums, Persian drums, deep and relentless, like the heartbeat of something monstrous. A boy, barely past his 14th winter, tightened his grip on his spear. His knuckles bled from the cold, and his eyes searched the mist for the shape of his father, who had fallen the day before. There was no time to grieve, no space to mourn. Even the rituals of death had been suspended. The pyres would be built not from wood, but from memory. Leonidas turned then, slowly, as if the weight of his armor had grown heavier overnight. His gaze swept over the line. There were no more tactics, no more flanks to guard, only the final stand, the final breath, the final noise before silence. The Thespian commander, Demophilus, bowed his head not in deference but in recognition. A nod passed between the two men, brief, wordless, final. The air shifted. The Persian line advanced. Shields raised, spears poised. The pass became a crucible. The first wave struck like hail on roof tiles, wild and countless. Arrows fell thick, their shafts snapping in the gravel. Men shouted, staggered, closed ranks. Blood sprayed in arcs over polished bronze and raw wool. Limbs crumpled. Screams split the air and vanished just as quickly into the clamor. But the Greeks held. Again, the Persians charged, now with greater force. This time they surged forward with axes, with sickle swords, their banners whipping behind them like fire. And still the Greeks stood, not with fury, but with the grim steadiness of men who have already crossed the threshold into death. Time warped. A minute felt like an hour felt like a breath. The hot springs steamed on, the cliffs loomed impassive, and then from the rear, a whisper became a roar. They had come. The immortals, guided by betrayal, guided by Ephialtes, whose name would drip with rot for centuries to come. Leonidas knew. He did not speak. He did not curse the traitor. Instead, he motioned, one final gesture, and the last circle tightened. Spartans, Thespians, Helots, those who had chosen the grave over retreat. They formed around him like petals around the heart of a flower blooming in fire. The others, those ordered to withdraw, did so in silence, their feet muffled in dust and grief. Some wept, some could not. All would carry the guilt of that departure for the rest of their days. The final stand was not glorious. It was not triumphant. It was sweat in the eyes, bile in the throat, torn tendons and shattered bone. It was the reek of blood and unwashed bodies, of burned hair and salt. It was the collapse of comrades mid-cry, the stagger back into formation, the scream of a name no one answered. It was Leonidas falling, his shield slipping, his sword buried to the hilt in flesh, and his body surrounded by those who refused to let it be taken. And then silence fell, not all at once but gradually, like a curtain lowered over a stage. The last cries ebbed, the clamor faded, the arrows ceased to fall. In the end, there was only the sea, lapping the shore as it always had, and the wind, moving gently now, curling through the pass like a mourner in a cloister. The bodies lay where they had fallen, shields cracked, spears broken, blood congealing in the dust. A single raven circled overhead, cawing once before vanishing behind the cliff's edge. And there, amid the carnage, the hot springs still steamed, indifferent. A few feet away, a Thespian hand still clutched the carved token of his child, a crude wooden horse, blackened now by ash. The smoke rose in soft pillars, curling upward as if seeking heaven. They would carve a monument here, in time, a lion to mark where Leonidas fell. But memory had already taken root, silent, eternal, and heavy as stone. The chapter closes, but the story deepens. For betrayal does not end in death. It seeps into the hearts of those left behind. And as the smoke of Thermopylae thins into the mountain air, the winds begin to turn south, toward Athens, toward vengeance, toward the burning of a city and the last echo of a sacrifice that refused to be forgotten. The hot gates had closed, but in their silence, a fire had been lit, a fire that would burn all the brighter in what was to come. It began in a hush broken only by crows. Their wings stirred the air like torn parchment, circling the jagged cliffs that loomed over the pass like sleeping titans. Beneath them, bodies moved like shadows, Spartans tightening greaves with stiffened fingers, Thespians brushing frost from their shoulders, helots wiping blood from blades already dulled by repetition. The third day had come, and the stones of Thermopylae still held the heat of spilled blood. The narrow road lay stretched between mountain and sea, a throat that could neither breathe nor scream. Morning rose without warmth. The sun, slow and indifferent, cast a pale light across the scorched helmets, catching the rivulets of salt and sweat that lined each man's brow. No songs marked the hour. No banners stirred. Only the low murmur of preparation, the muted creak of leather, the hiss of a whetstone along a pitted spearhead, the soft recitation of names whispered like prayers before silence. They had stood together now for days. Not merely Spartans, but men from across Greece. The 700 Thespians among them had not left. When Leonidas gave the allies leave to retreat before the final assault, Demophilus and his citizens had remained. There was no glory promised, no monument assured, only choice. And in that choice, defiance became holy. Each man was a different stitch in the same fraying cloth. The Spartans drilled from childhood to fall as one. The Thespians, artisans and farmers, their hands uncalloused by war but firm with resolve. The Helots, slaves and servants, whose names would not be etched into marble, but whose bones would bleed into the same soil. They stood not as soldiers, but as men pulled into the gravity of sacrifice. The path narrowed here into the sheer rock face. On one side, cliffs sharp as razors. On the other, the sea, its edge frothing with foam as if churning in grief. Between them lay dust, trampled and soaked with blood from the days before. Arrows littered the earth like black teeth. Broken spear shafts stuck out like roots clawing from a dying tree. They knew what was coming. Word had arrived in the night, carried not by messenger but by silence itself. Ephialtes, the name would not yet curse generations, but it trembled in their mouths, had shown the Persians the goat trail behind the pass. The flank would be turned. The trap was closing. Leonidas had gathered them beneath torchlight, the flames shivering on the stone walls like omens. His voice was quiet. There was no flourish. He merely offered departure to those who would take it. And many did, some reluctantly, some weeping, all carrying the guilt of survival before the dying had even begun. But the rest stayed. Now, in this final dawn, their faces were drained of color, but not of courage. A Thespian boy, no older than 16, tied his sandals with trembling hands. He wore no armor, only a wool tunic too large for his thin frame. His lips moved silently, reciting a verse, perhaps, or a farewell. Beside him, an old helot rubbed a stone talisman between his fingers, its surface worn smooth from years of pocket prayers. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The Persians came not in a wave, but in a storm. Their numbers seemed to stretch beyond the cliffs, banners flaring like fire. Drums pounded in unnatural rhythm, echoing off the stone like a god's heartbeat. Their arrows darkened the sky once more, blotting out the weak sun. They fell like rain, but the Greeks did not scatter. Their shields locked into a single shell, their feet planted in earth soaked with blood not yet dry. Time broke open. The clash was not swift. It was grinding, agonizing. Steel met steel, bone snapped beneath blade, and voices shrieked before being swallowed by dust. Men fell forward onto the corpses of their kin, hands still grasping for weapons. Spears shattered, teeth cracked. The pass became a furnace, and the men within it, embers burning down to ash. Leonidas fought at the center, his blade red from hilt to tip, his cloak now more wound than wool. When he fell, it was not with a cry, but with a silence that carved through the chaos. His body was dragged behind the line, not to be saved. No one would be saved, but to be guarded. They would not let him be taken. Even in death, he was a symbol too powerful to yield. The Thespians circled next. Their losses had been heavy already, and now the Persian tide surged upon them. But they did not falter. They tightened formation. They moved as one. They fought not as those who hoped to win, but as those who refused to yield. A Thespian father saw his son fall and did not turn. He simply stepped forward into his place. A Spartan, wounded and unable to lift his shield, bit the lip of his enemy's sword hand and did not let go until death claimed them both. By mid-morning, it was over. The pass was a graveyard, the sea wind carrying the scent of blood and burnt hair, smoke lifted from fires set by Persian hands to cleanse the field. And yet, amid the blackened earth, the silence was not empty. It hummed with the memory of defiance. The bodies lay unburied. That would come later, if it came at all. The Thespians had no monument. Not yet. No statue, no shrine. But they had this place, these rocks, this narrow throat of land where death had been chosen and not simply endured. The camera lingers on the talisman dropped in the dust, half buried in ash. A raven pecks at a broken spear. Somewhere, far to the south, Athens waits. Its people unaware that Thermopylae has fallen, that Leonidas and Demophilus have become myth, and that the cost of delay, of sacrifice, now presses like fire into the heart of Greece. As the smoke clears and the sun sets behind the cliffs, one can almost hear the last breath of the fallen carried on the sea wind, an echo, soft and defiant, that whispers not of defeat but of remembrance. They died in the narrow pass, but they broke something wider open, and what comes next is vengeance. Before the marble lion was raised, before the epitaph carved, there was only the smoke, rising in spirals from the broken bodies that littered the narrow pass like discarded oaths. The wind moved gently that morning, as if hesitant to disturb the dead. It curled through blood-slick rocks and over scorched cloaks, lifting dust from shattered shields. The hot gates, once roaring with defiance, had grown unnaturally still. A silence not of peace, but aftermath. A silence swollen with the weight of what had passed. In the far distance, beneath a bleeding horizon, the first of the scavenger birds began to circle. This was where it ended. Not in triumph, not even in glorious ruin, but in a stillness that echoed louder than any war cry. Leonidas lay where the final line had broken, his lifeless eyes fixed skyward, as if gazing upon the gods that had watched him fall. His sword still rested in the hand that once ruled a kingdom. His body surrounded by his kin and allies, each now silent as stone. But the story had not truly ended, because history does not bury its truth so easily. Beneath the dust, beneath the bones, beneath the shallow layer of ash that coated the earth like mourning linen, there were echoes. And these echoes would ripple across time, calling out not only the names of kings, but those of forgotten men who stood beside them. In the days that preceded the lion's tomb, in the haze of early dawn, the pass had smelled of old iron and earth warmed by fire. The steam from the nearby sulfur springs had drifted like breath between the armor plates. Then it had been filled with motion, blades sharpened by steady hands, brief laughter shared around a skin of wine, nervous boys learning how to wrap their fingers tight around spear shafts without trembling. It had not just been Spartans. That is what the stones try to forget. But memory clings to the details, the fingerprints left in cooling blood, the string of a sandal snapped in the mud, the woven thread of a Thespian mother's charm tied around her son's neck. 700 of them. Men of the artisan class, carpenters, vintners, masons, poets, citizens of a small city who had chosen to remain in a battle they could not survive. Demophilus led them not with pride, but with clarity. He knew their fate, but some deaths are not meant to be avoided. Some are meant to shape the bones of nations. Even the Helots had stood their ground, bound to their Spartan lords in life, yet choosing to share their death. Their stories were never etched in marble, but the earth remembers them still. They died with hands clenched, with blades borrowed, with teeth bared against a tide they had never chosen, but stood against all the same. And when the immortals came, glinting and endless, they did not pause to honor this defiance. They swept through like wind through dry grass. The final stand was a thing of slow agony. Phalanxes breaking, shields overturned, the ground soaking up blood faster than the springs could purge it. Leonidas fell last, or close to it. His men fought to protect his body even after life had left him. They dragged him from the crush of Persian feet, propping him beneath a cleft in the stone where his back could rest against the mountain, where his lifeless form would face the enemy until the last of them fell. Even the Persians, when they came upon him, hesitated. But hesitation is not mercy. His head would be severed, his corpse defiled, dragged through the dirt by Xerxes' orders. No divine favor spared his flesh. But it is not the king's skull that endures in memory. It is the men who circled him like brothers around a funeral pyre, who refused to let the flame die alone. And in the days that followed, it rained. Not heavily, but enough to slick the stones, to clean the wounds no one would bandage, enough to turn dust into paste and to push blood into the soil where roots would one day drink it, enough for time to begin its slow work of forgetting. But the echoes remained. A Theban survivor, one of the few who departed before the final slaughter, would speak of the last stand only once. His voice cracked, his eyes fixed on some horizon no one else could see. He said there was a sound just before the last Spartan fell, a sound like a bell tolling from deep within the mountain, though no bell had ever been hung there. A sound that rang not from steel or voice, but from the very heart of the stone. Others would call it myth, folklore, madness. But when, decades later, a sculptor was commissioned to raise a lion over the site of Leonidas' death, he claimed that he dreamed the shape before he ever carved it, that it came to him in sleep, roaring not with anger, but grief, that when his chisel first struck the marble, the wind howled through the pass as if remembering. The lion still stands. Its face is worn smooth by time, its roar forever caught in stone. It watches over the bones buried beneath it, though none remain to name them. And it remembers, not just the king, but the hands that lifted him, the voices that fell beside him, the feet that did not turn away. And so, as the chapter closes beneath the lion's gaze, we are left not with resolution, but with a burden, to remember the ones the monuments forget, to listen for echoes in the places where only silence speaks. And as that silence deepens, as the wind once more curls through the ancient stones, we are drawn southward, toward the burning of Athens, the smoke of vengeance, and the firelight of a rising defiance. Because the pass was only the beginning, and the war was not yet done. The torches flickered low in the final hour before dawn, their flames trembling in the mountain wind like old men's hands before prayer. Along the narrow pass, the line had reformed in silence. No orders called out, no trumpet blared. The men moved as one, shields lifted, spears steadied, feet planted in dirt packed by the blood of the day before. Behind them, the cliffs stood tall and blind, bearing no witness. Ahead, the sea whispered its ancient song, indifferent as ever. Salt hung in the air. Salt and smoke and something deeper still, the scent of sacrifice not yet made. It was the last day. They knew it not from some messenger or vision, but from the feel in their bones, from the quiet nods exchanged between commanders, from the prayers whispered not aloud but under breath, mumbled like spells to old gods and forgotten heroes. It was in the way the sky refused to brighten and how the shadows refused to scatter. Among the Spartans, Leonidas stood still, his hand resting not on his sword, but on the shoulder of a boy too young for this field. The lad had not spoken since the second assault, when his brother fell beside him and was dragged, choking, beneath a wall of bodies. But he had not run. Not then. Not now. His shield, too heavy for him, was gripped like an oath. Beside them, the Thespians sang. It was a quiet tune, no more than a hum passed from throat to throat, old, without words. A melody sung on days of harvest and remembrance. A song for their wives, for their children, for the gods who might be watching. Their commander, Demophilus, did not lead it. He simply let it rise like mist from the mouths of men who had nothing left to offer but song. They had chosen to stay, not bound by Spartan law or shame, not forced by kings or threats, but of their own will. When Leonidas offered retreat, they had shaken their heads. They would not leave. Thespia would not send its sons to war and recall them in fear. They would stand and fall and be remembered or forgotten, but never shamed. The line held tight. The Persians gathered beyond the mouth of the pass, their banners rippling like fire, their numbers a tide ready to break. Xerxes had grown impatient. He had seen his best cut down by farmers, poets, and disciplined men who died not for glory, but for delay. And now delay would end. The first wave came swift and shrieking. The immortals, Persia's finest, charged like wolves down the narrowing throat. But the Greeks did not flinch. The shields held, the spears pierced, and the phalanx moved as a single beast, breathing, bracing, bleeding. Sand kicked up in clouds, blinding eyes, coating tongues. The air grew thick with iron and cries. Hours passed, or moments. Time twisted with each fall of the blade. The Spartans rotated ranks with practiced grace, their blood seeping into sandals. The Thespians fought with less rhythm, but no less fury. They fought for no kingdom, only for one another. One fell, another took his place. A carpenter, a priest, a boy no older than the one standing beside Leonidas. When a spear snapped, it became a club. When a shield cracked, it became a wall. Even when wounds opened wide and would not stop flowing, the line stood. There was no room for pain, only place, only duty. But then Ephialtes returned, not in flesh, but in consequence. From the rear cliffs came the sound, marching, armor, movement on the high path he had revealed to the Persian king. They were surrounded now, truly. Death had arrived not just from the front, but from behind. It crept down the goat path like rot, ready to seal the tomb from both ends. Leonidas knew. He gave the final command not with words, but with his body. He turned, faced the men, and raised his spear skyward. Once. Twice, a signal. And they closed in, Spartan, Thespian, Helot, Theban, shoulder to shoulder, back to back. The circle formed, a knot in the throat of history. The drums of Persia thundered now like storm. The arrows darkened the sky. The air pulsed with fury. Then came the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind that hovers just before the sky splits open. A silence not of peace, but of consequence. And in that silence, the song returned. One voice, then another. The Thespians, still singing, bloodied mouths lifting melody against the roar, their voices rising like smoke from funeral pyres. Even as the circle broke, even as Leonidas fell, he dropped to one knee, his shield half buried in the earth, his spear lost in a heap of bodies, his breath shallow, his crown of bronze cracked. He looked not to heaven, but to his men. Then he was still, and the rest followed. In the end, it was not swords that ended them, but the tide. They were pulled under, smothered by numbers, by exhaustion, by fate. Their bodies layered atop one another, a cairn of flesh and resolve. The Persians advanced, and then paused. Even they could feel it, that something sacred had transpired here. By nightfall, the field was quiet again. Only the wounded moaned. Only the crows sang. The shields remained where they had fallen, cracked, splintered, stained, silent, each one a story, each one a name. Some now lost to time. Others whispered still in hidden corners of Greece, where old songs are sung by older men, and children ask why tears gather in their fathers' eyes. The next morning, a breeze stirred the dust, catching in the broken rim of a Thespian's shield. It rang, faint and hollow, like a bell forgotten by its tower. And so we pass into what comes next, beyond the death of heroes, beyond the echo of defiance, into the hunger of vengeance. And the fire that would consume what was once called invincible. The torches flickered low in the final hour before dawn, their flames trembling in the mountain wind like old men's hands before prayer. Along the narrow pass, the line had reformed in silence. No orders called out, no trumpet blared. The men moved as one, shields lifted, spears steadied, feet planted in dirt packed by the blood of the day before. Behind them, the cliff stood tall and blind, bearing no witness. Ahead, the sea whispered its ancient song, indifferent as ever. Salt hung in the air. Salt and smoke and something deeper still, the scent of sacrifice not yet made. It was the last day. They knew it not from some messenger or vision, but from the feel in their bones, from the quiet nods exchanged between commanders, from the prayers whispered not aloud, but under breath, mumbled like spells to old gods and forgotten heroes. It was in the way the sky refused to brighten and how the shadows refused to scatter. Among the Spartans, Leonidas stood still, his hand resting not on his sword, but on the shoulder of a boy too young for this field. The lad had not spoken since the second assault, when his brother fell beside him and was dragged, choking, beneath a wall of bodies. But he had not run. Not then. Not now. His shield, too heavy for him, was gripped like an oath. Beside them, the Thespians sang. It was a quiet tune, no more than a hum passed from throat to throat, old, without words. A melody sung on days of harvest and remembrance, a song for their wives, for their children, for the gods who might be watching. Their commander, Demophilus, did not lead it. He simply let it rise like mist from the mouths of men who had nothing left to offer but song. They had chosen to stay, not bound by Spartan law or shame, not forced by kings or threats, but of their own will. When Leonidas offered retreat, they had shaken their heads. They would not leave. Thespiae would not send its sons to war and recall them in fear. They would stand and fall and be remembered, or forgotten, but never shamed. The line held tight. The Persians gathered beyond the mouth of the pass, their banners rippling like fire, their numbers a tide ready to break. Xerxes had grown impatient. He had seen his best cut down by farmers, poets, and disciplined men who died not for glory, but for delay. And now delay would end. The first wave came swift and shrieking. The immortals, Persia's finest, charged like wolves down the narrowing throat. But the Greeks did not flinch. The shields held, the spears pierced, and the phalanx moved as a single beast, breathing, bracing, bleeding. Sand kicked up in clouds, blinding eyes, coating tongues. The air grew thick with iron and cries. Hours passed, or moments. Time twisted with each fall of the blade. The Spartans rotated ranks with practiced grace, their blood seeping into sandals. The Thespians fought with less rhythm, but no less fury. They fought for no kingdom, only for one another. One fell, another took his place, a carpenter, a priest, a boy no older than the one standing beside Leonidas. When a spear snapped, it became a club. When a shield cracked, it became a wall. Even when wounds opened wide and would not stop flowing, the line stood. There was no room for pain, only place, only duty. But then Ephialtes returned, not in flesh, but in consequence. From the rear cliffs came the sound, marching, armor, movement on the high path he had revealed to the Persian king. They were surrounded now, truly. Death had arrived not just from the front, but from behind. It crept down the goat path like rot, ready to seal the tomb from both ends. Leonidas knew. He gave the final command not with words, but with his body. He turned, faced the men, and raised his spear skyward. Once, twice, a signal. And they closed in, Spartan, Thespian, Helote, Theban, shoulder to shoulder, back to back. The circle formed, a knot in the throat of history. The drums of Persia thundered now like storm. The arrows darkened the sky. The air pulsed with fury. Then came the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind that hovers just before the sky splits open. A silence not of peace, but of consequence. And in that silence, the song returned. One voice. Then another. The Thespians. Still singing, bloodied mouths lifting melody against the roar, their voices rising like smoke from funeral pyres. Even as the circle broke, even as Leonidas fell, he dropped to one knee, his shield half buried in the earth, his spear lost in a heap of bodies, his breath shallow, his crown of bronze cracked. He looked not to heaven, but to his men. Then he was still, and the rest followed. In the end, it was not swords that ended them, but the tide. They were pulled under, smothered by numbers, by exhaustion, by fate. Their bodies layered atop one another, a cairn of flesh and resolve. The Persians advanced, and then paused. Even they could feel it, that something sacred had transpired here. By nightfall, the field was quiet again. Only the wounded moaned. Only the crows sang. The shields remained where they had fallen, cracked, splintered, stained, silent. Each one a story, each one a name, some now lost to time. Others whispered still in hidden corners of Greece, where old songs are sung by older men, and children ask why tears gather in their fathers' eyes. The next morning, a breeze stirred the dust, catching in the broken rim of a Thespian's shield. It rang, faint and hollow, like a bell forgotten by its tower. And so we pass into what comes next, beyond the death of heroes, beyond the echo of defiance, into the hunger of vengeance, and the fire that would consume what was once called invincible. Rain fell without force, as if the heavens had grown weary of grief. Fine drops landed soft upon the stone, turning dust to clay, smearing dried blood into fading patterns that had once been the shapes of men. They fell on helmets with no heads beneath them, on broken spears wedged between bodies, on a scrap of linen still bearing the embroidery of a name no one would speak again. Thermopylae had fallen, and in its stillness, the pass breathed shallow, as if reluctant to remember what it had just consumed. A dove passed overhead, silent and pale against the bruised sky. It landed not on stone or shield, but on a torn banner half buried in the earth. Its colors no longer bright, its emblem a ghost of a city that had given its sons to a place that would not keep their names. Among them were the Thespians. They had no monument, no lion to watch over them, no royal decree to mark their valor. They had followed Demophilus not into glory, but into silence. When offered retreat, they chose instead the bitter path, the narrow one, marked not by victory but by absence. It was not a soldier's oath that held them, but something older. Perhaps love, perhaps shame, perhaps the simple refusal to let another man bear their death for them. Their last meal had been shared in whispers. A crust of bread soaked in goat's milk, dried olives passed hand to hand. A skin of cheap wine emptied without ceremony. They did not feast. There was no celebration, only the rustle of cloaks tightened against the cold, the creak of leather as armor was fastened, and the occasional clearing of a throat choked more by thought than dust. The Helots moved among them in silence. Not slaves now, but brothers, bound not by chains, but by shared fate. One old man, blind in one eye, pressed a small wooden token into the palm of a boy too young for a sword. "For your mother," he whispered, though he did not know her. Perhaps he had no mother of his own, only memory. When the Persians came again, they did not rush. They came like a tide at low moon, inevitable, cold, and full of purpose. Xerxes had grown tired of defiance. The pass would be cleared. The delay had cost him too much. But even then, the Greeks did not bend. They formed one last wall, Spartans and Thespians and Helots and men who had forgotten where they were from. There were no battle lines now, only circles. Only hands gripped tight around the hafts of spears dulled by 3 days of war. Only backs braced against the rock. Only eyes fixed not on the enemy, but on one another. They knew. The sky darkened with arrows. Screams rose, but did not last. Men fell. Others stepped. The phalanx broke and reformed again, like a body refusing death. But it could not hold. Leonidas fell, his sword arm severed. His shield cracked. He dropped to his knees, not in prayer, but in rage. His breath left him with a rattle, and then there was no breath at all. Around him the circle tightened. Blood pooled, cries turned to grunts, then to silence. The Thespians died in clumps, huddled where they had fought, near the bodies of those they loved. They were not elegant in their passing. There was no poetry, only torn flesh, only the smell of opened bodies and the iron tang of ruin. One man, face split open, clutched a broken flute in his hand, its final note never played. When the dust settled, the pass was a graveyard, not marked, not named. The Persians burned the bodies. Some say it was to honor the dead, others to erase them. Ash drifted upward, soft as pollen, drifting on a wind that had forgotten how to weep. The sky turned a sickly gray, the color of sorrow too old to name. And then it was over. The field cleared. The living moved on. The dead stayed behind. For weeks after, no one walked the pass. Shepherds avoided it. Birds circled wide. The springs that had once steamed with warmth grew cold. Something in the earth had changed. The rocks remembered. The soil held fast to the blood, refusing to let it leach away. But memory is a stubborn thing. Years passed. The lion rose to mark where Leonidas fell. Marble hewed by reverent hands, his name carved deep, his image grand. But the Thespians were not mentioned. The Helots even less so. Their shields were not placed in temples. Their weapons not collected. Their stories faded. Yet in Thespiae, an old woman still left bread at the altar. A boy grew up wondering why his father never returned from a war no one spoke of. A mason refused to sing on feast days, his voice hoarse with unshed grief. And beneath the lion's paw, the earth shifted. Not in defiance, but in whisper. A vine grew from the stone, twisting slowly, impossibly, across the base of the monument. It bore no fruit. But each year, it bloomed small white flowers. They smelled of smoke and time. And when the wind blew just right, they carried a scent no one could name. Perhaps memory. Perhaps the breath of those who died, not for glory, but for choice. Perhaps something more. And now, as we move forward in this story, past the burning of the pass, past the ashes of forgotten shields, we must ask, what does a nation owe its dead? And what do the dead ask in return? The torchlight crackled low on the limestone wall, casting shadows like ancient runes across the rock. It was the hour just before dawn, neither night nor morning, when the world forgets itself. The wind slipped down the cliff face in cold ribbons, stirring dust and ash along the blood-hardened ground. And beneath it, in the pass where gods had been silent for 3 days, came the sound of footsteps. Not many, just enough to betray the earth. Ephialtes moved like a ghost through the underbrush, his face cloaked, his hand clenched around the promise of silver. Behind him, the glint of Persian steel reflected torchlight in sharp flickers. He did not speak, nor did they ask. He merely pointed upward toward the hidden goat path that wound like a serpent behind the Greek rear flank. This, then, was the sound of betrayal. Not a shout, not a sword in the back, but silence broken only by breath and greed. In the pass below, the defenders did not yet know. They sharpened blades that were already dull, wiped dry lips with the back of tired hands, and braced for the coming storm. Their eyes were hollowed from nights without sleep, their limbs stiff from the cold. But still they stood, Spartans in iron, Thespians with their hearts bared, Helots clinging not to survival, but to defiance. Their breath steamed in the chill. Their eyes did not lift toward the ridge above. They had not yet been given their hour. Leonidas stirred by the fire's last glow, rising slowly as if every bone in his body bore the weight of the kingdom. He said nothing. He simply gazed at his men, boys too young for scars, fathers too young for death, and nodded once. That was all. The sky grew pale, not with sun, but with the swelling light of doom. It was then that word came. A runner, face streaked with dust, reached the Spartan camp, collapsed to his knees there, and rasped the single name that tore through the marrow of the men like a blade. Ephialtes. The king closed his eyes, not in disbelief, but in confirmation. He had expected this. Treachery was the final certainty of war, and so he turned not to curse, but to command. Orders were brief, precise. The allied contingents, those who had not yet sworn themselves to death, were given leave. Some hesitated, others wept. All knew what this meant. They would leave, and the rest would die. Leonidas did not waver, neither did Demophilus of Thespiae. He stepped forward, calm as stone, and said he and his men would stay. The Helots, too, remained, not as slaves, but as brothers in arms. The Thebans, divided and unsure, hovered on the edge of the decision. Some would flee, some would fall. And so the circle formed. They stood together one final time. A knot of resolve in the throat of Greece. The torchlight faded as dawn stretched its fingers over the hills, Defiant, casting long shadows over the narrow pass. From the east came the low murmur of the Persian army assembling. From the rear, the echo of marching feet, Persians climbing the hidden path that now betrayed the defenders' backs. They were surrounded, and still they did not run. Their weapons were no longer sharp, their armor chipped, but their hearts had calcified into something that could not break. The Persians descended from both sides, and the Greeks moved. They did not shout. There were no final war cries, just the sound of shields locking together like the closing of a tomb, just the clink of iron drawn once more, just the thud of sandals into sacred earth. They made their stand on a small hillock of stone, ringed with bodies already cooling, their final ground. The assault came swift, like a river breaking a dam. The Persian forces surged, driven by rage, fatigue, and the will of a king denied. Arrows fell first, blotting out the sky. Then came the soldiers, relentless and vast, crashing into the Greek line. The circle held. Every man became more than a man, a blade, a shield, a wall, a name that would not yield. Leonidas fought at the center, his spear breaking in his grasp, his shield arm numb, blood pouring from his thigh. He fought with the force of a storm, the memory of his ancestors burning behind his eyes. When he fell, it was not with fear, but with fury. His sword in the throat of an enemy. His final breath carried on a growl of resistance. The Thespians fell beside him, one by one, two by two, until Demophilus himself dropped to his knees, his tunic soaked with blood not his own. He pressed his forehead to the ground, murmured something in the tongue of his childhood, and was gone. The Helots fought with broken tools, mallets, sickles, clubs fashioned from fallen limbs. They did not hold formation, but they did not flee. They died like free men. By midday, the hill was still. The Persians stood above it, triumphant yet hushed. Their enemies lay stacked in death. But something in the silence, something in the way the bodies had fallen, facing outward, weapons still clutched, kept the victors from cheering. They gathered the corpses. Xerxes, furious, ordered the body of Leonidas stripped and defiled, his head severed and displayed upon a spike. A message to the Greeks. But the message was not one of fear. It was of flame, because word of the betrayal spread faster than arrows, and in its wake came wrath. Athens would burn, but not before rising. The Greeks would rally at Salamis, at Plataea, on soil and sea. But here, at Thermopylae, the seed was planted, in ash, in betrayal, in the blood of those who chose to die not for conquest, but for principle. And as the Persian army moved on, the pass emptied of voices, a single breeze stirred the hilltop, lifting dust from the shattered shields. Among them, a vine had begun to creep, green and fragile, curling through a crack in the rock. Life, blooming quietly where betrayal had once passed. The war was not over, but something sacred had been born, and what comes next is not surrender, it is reckoning.